The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Georgie Anne Geyer was this country's first woman foreign correspondent, covering a beat of revolutions, guerrilla movements, and government upheaval, doing a job once described as being one of the few trying to enter countries most people are trying to leave. Geyer is the author of several books, most recently Americans No More, and her 1983 autobiography, Buying the Night Flight, was reissued in the fall of 1996. She is a syndicated columnist who writes about foreign policy and international affairs and is a regular panelist on Washington Week in Review. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you, Marcia.
Tell me what first attracted you to the business of being a foreign correspondent.
Well, I think everything. I always wanted to write from the time I was a very small child. My mother taught me to read and write when I was 4.
In fact, you wrote a novel when you were 10.
I did. I wrote a novel when I was 10, and I still have it, but no one shall ever see it.
But you say you were the hero of that book,
Of
and
course.
I always wanted to know what you did in it.
I was a little girl who had a twin, and we were separated very young, and the story is about finding my twin. Now, I'm sure psychiatrists will find some deep meaning in that. But I also, we traveled a lot around this country. My family did. My father had a small dairy business in Chicago, Geyer's Dairy. And I think it's fair to say the whole family was very adventuresome. I mean, we were always looking for things around our own country, historic monuments and sites, and went off with a great sense of adventure, which parents can give to children if they feel that way. And then when I went to Northwestern, I studied in Mexico for 3 months and started to learn Spanish. Then I had a Fulbright to Vienna, and then I was lost. Then I was just going to be I had to somehow combine the writing and the foreign interest.
You use include a quote from Alistair Cooke in your autobiography that talks about a kind of freedom that's involved in working outside the borders of your country, as opposed to being a domestic reporter.
Yes, well, for one thing, you lose a lot of the strictures of life when you go to other countries, and adventurers, explorers have always spoken about that. In fact, the title of my book, Buying the Night Flight, comes from Saint-Exupéry, who wrote about these kinds of people. He said, there is no buying the night flight with its 100,000 stars, its serenity, and its moment of sovereignty. And then Alistair Cooke picks that up when he talks about the work of the foreign correspondent, about how different it is from the work of the local reporter, because the foreign correspondent has to assume that he or she knows nothing and has to start in every society from the bottom and learn everything. You don't just learn one beat as you would in Seattle or Chicago, where I worked for the Daily News, or New York, or one of the other cities. You have to know everything. You have to know about the politics of the country and the economics and the history and the waterworks and the river systems. So it's a very, very demanding job.
When you would land in a country, how would you begin that process? Did you develop a kind of checklist or recipe for getting to know the territory?
Well, I sort of would go into a corner and look around. You know, you can tell an awful lot by really looking. And I think good foreign correspondents, like good writers, good observers, all kind of listen very carefully. I also did, young people don't really like to hear this, but I love history, and I did a lot of historical research, because if you know the history of a people, just as if you know the history of a person, you know what they're going to do again, because people repeat and repeat and repeat. So when I would interview someone like Anwar Sadat or Gaddafi or Khomeini or Arafat or Fidel Castro, I knew a great deal about them. So it was not easy to fool me and not easy to put me on.
Mm-hmm. There was a point also in your autobiography where you talk about the art of interviewing, and said that perhaps women are better equipped to do that? Because I think the phrase you used was a kind of empathic immersion that women do when they're doing an interview.
Yes, Marcia, I think that men and women, at least in my experience, interview very, very differently. Because sometimes I've done interviews with my male colleagues, whom I'm very fond of, and we're all great, great pals. But when we would go in together, say there's usually a man leader that we're interviewing, and they would set up immediately this confrontational style, like two male dogs, you know, up against each other. Well, what do you think about that? You know, you can almost hear them going. But I didn't do that. I didn't feel I had to. When I would go in by myself, I would sit there, and usually I wouldn't say anything, and the man would talk, because men like to talk to women. And I can be very directive if necessary, but I find the non-directive approach usually the best, because they start out by telling you what's really on their mind and what's really important, and you don't sidetrack them with issues that you may think are important, but are not the primary ones on their mind. And most often, I mean, whether it was Anwar Sadat or many of the others, I would just sort of sit there, nicely dressed and friendly, and ready to listen, and they would talk. And so I got very good interviews without a great deal of effort. Of course, my interviews with Fidel Castro, you know, you don't have to ask any questions, because he starts talking, and 9 hours later he stops talking. And if you can stand that, I mean, it's very tiresome.
One of the interviews that you did, you felt you were able to understand a great deal about him. This was the Ayatollah Khomeini, who you interviewed in Paris. You just rolled your eyes a little bit, because it was what you did and didn't do with that interview that you've reflected about years later.
Yes, and it was a very unpleasant interview. I think I understood him all too well. When I sat there with him in one of his westernized young Persian men, I was all covered up because they put a little shawl over my face with just my eyes showing, which I'm convinced was to protect him from my extraordinary beauty. But we don't need to comment on that. A man of his age, you know, in his years. But during the interview, which was about an hour, I really felt these waves of evil coming from this man. I mean, it was like the waves of a sea. And since I don't go around usually feeling waves of evil, it was quite unique. He has these very dark, sinister eyes, which he just stared between us for this whole hour, as though he were seeing something that we were not seeing, which was probably the many hundreds of thousands of people he would kill in the years to come. But what was complicated as a journalist was, here I'd had this rather terrific interview. I mean, he hardly saw anyone in those 2 weeks he was in Paris before he went to Iran, back to Iran, and overthrew the Shah. But I knew my history, Marcia, so I knew that the Persian Shiites, having been long an oppressed and many times conquered group of Islam, that they believed in a tenet called dissimulation, which means simply lying for the faith. And it was a protective coloring, in effect. So everything he said in the interview, which was that Iran would be a democracy, that women would be free to do anything they want. He said they could be doctors or lawyers. I knew that everything he was saying was false.
But you couldn't say that in the story that you wrote.
How do you write a column saying that? So what I did was, I think, about as unsatisfactory as anything. I quoted what he said, and then I said probably it was not true because of this tenet of dissimulation. So I think my poor readers really had no idea whatsoever of what I was trying to do.
Most people know that the business of reporting involves at least two phases. That's the gathering of information and then the sharing of that information with an audience. You write on several occasions about a second step that's less visible, and it was almost like there's a wonderful picture in The Family of Man of a group of children playing cards, and a little girl is sitting holding the cards to her chest, and there is this point when you're a reporter where you just love to hang on to it.
Yes, I think that is you're on to me. This is very, very dangerous indeed. I think that is my favorite. I love to write. I have to write. But I think the stage in reporting that I like the best is psyching out a society and psyching out a person that I want to get to. let's say it's a he, who knows him that I can get to? Who can get me to him and will get me to him? What are the cultural proclivities of these people that I can use? And I don't mean in a nasty way, but in a slightly Machiavellian way, because you have to set up these situations. You have to know the structures that you're dealing with and the personalities. And then once you have that, that's why I got so many interviews. Once, for instance, an example, I was able to get into Libya at a time when Gaddafi was an important character, and it was very hard to get in. They weren't letting any Americans in, and I was able to get in.
Why? Why you?
Well, because I had worked it out. I sent an Egyptian woman friend of mine in, and I paid for it, and the paper would have paid for it even if it hadn't worked, but it did work. I'm very honest, but they knew the things you had to do. And he had inaugurated this policy of Americans had to write their data on the passport in Arabic. Well, that defaces a passport, so you can't do that. But she was able to get me invited. I paid my way, but I was officially invited, so they didn't have to deface the passport, which we couldn't do. But I got there, and they were having a cultural revolution, and they had promised the interview, but it never came, and I was there day after day, and it got to be 2 weeks. So I decided either I'm going to have to leave without it, the paper wouldn't have been happy, I'd already spent 2 weeks there, or do something. So I began to go into his cadre of young men, they're Arabs, of course, every day, and I'd say, "You are not Arabs. You are not Arabs." And of course they would get very startled and displeased. So why do you say that? And I said, because Arabs believe in honor. Arabs are honorable men. You promised me this interview with the president, with Gaddafi, and you haven't come through on it. Well, Marcia, it only took 3 days of that. And they were so humiliated that they arranged it that night. Now, he didn't say much in the interview, but I did.
You're humiliated or tired of you, one of the two things.
Exactly, both.
Your friend Mike Royko once said that you started in newsrooms when women were as rare as a teetotaler in the newsroom. You were a foreign correspondent when they were as rare as women among foreign correspondents. What were the pluses and the minuses? Did one outweigh the other? Advantage, disadvantage?
Well, I think Marcia, that young people, particularly young women today, can't really understand that there just were no women on newspaper staffs in those days. We had a quota the Chicago Daily News had a quota of 2, one in education and one for sob stories, which is what we called them in those days. So when I went in to be the 3rd, it was really quite amazing. And then there were absolutely none overseas. So when I went overseas for the Daily News to Latin America in 1964, it was really a groundbreaking event. I think the advantages were, well, for me personally, I was the only woman among a lot of men, and we were great, great pals. It was so much fun, and they treated me wonderfully. I was more like a mascot. You see, when there's only one woman, you're not a threat. Today, when there are 50% of women in journalism, they are a threat to the men. Mm. And I'm so glad I avoided that period, because we had so much fun, and I could do all my. They helped me with all my work, but that's not going to come again. The disadvantages were in Latin America, where I chose to go because the paper would have sent me to Vietnam. The men in power just didn't believe I was a journalist, and it took a long time. I finally started telling them, there were a lot of men making passes at me and so on, which was affecting me, my work. And so I started telling them I was married, and that didn't work because they were married too. It was a bond. And then I started telling them that I was madly in love with someone, and usually I was, and that worked. Mm. But I think there were a lot of advantages in those days, frankly.
How different is the whole career now, the career of being a foreign correspondent? Has it really changed since you were?
It's changed very dramatically. When I started in 1964, and I was a correspondent until 75, and then I've had my syndicated column since then, foreign correspondence was the glamour job on a newspaper. It was the height. It was the absolute top. The foreign correspondents, when they went overseas, they didn't come back usually. It was a lifetime. They were part scholars. They were linguists. When they came back to the paper, they had dinner with the publisher, not with the not with the reporters. You know, I mean, it was on that level. Today, there are many fewer correspondents. They don't have that cachet. As the younger journalists have become immeasurably more ambitious, their ambitions tend to take them up the ladder of the paper in this country. And so most of them don't want to go overseas, which of course is inexplicable for me.
Recently I read the editors of U.S. News and World Report, Newsweek, and Time all saying that one of the reasons there are fewer foreign correspondents is that especially since the end of the Cold War, there's less interest in this country in foreign news, partly because there are no more enemies, there are only dangers, as one of them put it.
I think there's some truth in that, but they're excusing their own unwillingness to fund foreign correspondence. It's a very expensive business. You know, when I left that field, although I still do I'm overseas all the time. But when I left in '75, it costs upwards of $200,000 a year for a paper to have a correspondent abroad, with all your filing costs and everything. And the papers and magazines themselves are just not as committed to it anymore. I don't believe the part that the American people are not interested in foreign news. They're not getting it, so it's hard for them to be interested in it. Our presidents don't tell them. We haven't had one speech by either of our last two presidents on Bosnia, which is the prototypal dangerous situation of the post-Cold War world. And all I say, Marcia, when people say, well, we can do without foreign news, I say, good luck. Good luck. Our economy is globalized. Chinese missiles can reach Los Angeles now. We have masses of illegal immigration, massive movements of people across the world. We have drug cartels taking over the Caribbean, moving up to the Mexican border. And I say to my American friends and fellow citizens, good luck. You have no choice.
Some of the things you just mentioned are also touched on in your newest book, which is Americans Know More. And this is a book that talks about what you see as a kind of balkanization within our borders. Can you talk about that a bit?
Exactly. Yes. For so many years, I was covering the rest of the world, and I love my country dearly, and I would come home in between, and of course I do all my citizenly duties and so on. But I never covered the U.S. My deep interest, of course, I read a lot and so on. And then I started covering illegal immigration and our borders because I thought that was part of my mandate, particularly from Latin America. Then I began to see not only were we beginning to have a lot of the same problems as those parts of the world I was seeing collapse, like Lebanon, like Bosnia, like virtually all of Africa, but that we were having problems with our citizenship. So I began to then look into citizenship, and I found the most extraordinary things because no one covers it. We sort of have taken that for granted. And I began to see that the same balkanizing facets or tendencies that I was seeing overseas, we're seeing here. Linguistic division. We are deliberately breaking ourselves down into linguistic conflictive groups, which is what different languages always do. A country that allows itself to be so broken down is just insane. Breaking down into group rights, which means groups that are formed by ethnic loyalties, by linguistic loyalties, by racial loyalties, rather than loyalties to the citizenship of the country. We have in this country today what they're calling in the courts a cultural defense. People who've come from other cultures now go into our courts routinely and argue that they have, say, a cultural defense. Say the Hmong tribesmen from South Vietnam have done this many times. Say they can beat their wives because that's the way it was done at home. We have globalization of the economy. You have people, the elites saying, well, I don't live in a nation state anymore. I live in the world. Again, I say, good luck if you need a policeman. These are just non-citizen voting. Non-citizens are voting. No relationship between citizenship and the benefits you get from the country, et cetera, et cetera.
A number of the issues and the themes in this book were also raised by Newt Gingrich in his book. Mm-hmm. One of them in particular, a pinpointing of the 1960s as a time when, in the view of both of you, a great deal of what you consider to be American began to unravel. Why the 60s?
I haven't read Newt's book, but I do quote him in there from some of his speeches, so I know that he had this interest. I would put it, Marcia, before the 60s. When I started my research, like everybody, everything went wrong in the 60s. But I found really that the death of our civic education in the universities, in our high schools, and death of teaching American history really started as early as the 30s and particularly gathered steam after the war. You had a lot of Marxist influence in the 30s in the universities. I'm not saying a communist threat. I'm not saying this is a much deeper thing. When the 60s came and the Vietnam War, which I also hated, and the assassinations of leaders and so on, that gave the radical students who were mostly alienated from our culture at that time, that gave them the target to release their pseudo-Marxist, radical cultural, it's a whole melange of things, multicultural tendencies. It gave them a focus. And after that, we had a whole series of laws that most people, most Americans, I surely did not know, Americans would not know that these happened. For instance, there was the Supreme Court decision in '82, which said that the children of illegal aliens must be educated in the U.S. Now, these are decisions that have led to all of this breaking down of citizenship as the primary guarantor of one's commitment to nation and one's expectation of benefits or welfare. And
Is there a circular argument, though, can't it, that if you don't educate these children, it will further disenfranchise them from becoming an American? I mean, there's a sort of circularity to a lot of these arguments.
Yes.
It's hard to figure out where they start and where they end.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, the judges in the 1982 case said that. And they argued that they should be educated in terms of public policy, not in terms of our laws. It took me days to find out what the wording on that really was. The problem here is if you control the border, you don't have these problems. And we're still not controlling the border. So we're not solving the problems. You know, if we keep putting our focus on and trying to solve the questions that are down the line, like education for the children of illegals, like another amnesty, which is what we're working toward now, which is another amnesty for illegals, which is rewarding them for breaking the law in America. Welfare benefits, which led to, for illegals, which led to Proposition 187 in California. We're dealing with the outcomes. We're not dealing with the problem. The problem is a nation state has to control its borders. It's actually the first duty of the American president.
There is a sentence in your book that really hopped off the page at me, and it goes back to the 60s, and particularly the 1965 Immigration Act, which you're quite critical of in this book. You said that one of the results of that was and the word you used was perversion of the ethnic and cultural mix of this country. If this country is, as you say, a nation of ideas, not birth and blood or creed, what difference does it make what the ethnic and cultural mix of the country is?
Well, that's a very good question, Marcia. It's a complex question.
It was the most troubling question I came away from this book with.
Well, always before in our immigration, I think you could say here for public policy reasons too, as does every country in the world, reserves places for its new immigrants on behalf, in terms of percentages of the racial groups we had before. In our terms, these would be Northern Europeans, English, Africans, but in terms of a percentage of the numbers who are of that background who are already in the country. Now, the '65 law, which has transformed this country, and despite the fact that Teddy Kennedy and the others said this will not make any difference, it actually went the other way, and it reserved 80 to 90% of the new places for the peoples of the third world. Now, this is a very, I don't apologize for saying this was a perversion, because you were inviting problems, you were inviting conflict, and the law was never debated. Immigration in this country has never been debated, and that's why so many Americans are feeling so out of sorts over this whole thing. Not only did this completely change the balance of factors in this country in terms of race, religion, and so on, but new immigrants were not taken after that in terms of skills, in terms of the needs of this country. They were taken strictly in terms of the poorest of the poor, and it gave the choices for the next generation of immigrants to those, because it also put in family reunification. You have cases today where one person from the third world, one person has brought 88, 90 of his or her relatives. And so what we are doing is loading the country with people who do not have the skills that we need, and we have refused to think rationally about this and say, what do we want in terms of the new immigrants? How many do we want? We had an immigration moratorium from 1924 to 1946 because we were not assimilating. Well, now we're really not assimilating.
Part of it may be something I was just reading in the New York Times the other day, our capacity to help people make this transition. The English classes, for example, in community colleges in Los Angeles run 18, 20 hours a day and are packed. In New York City, for example, the waiting list for some English classes are 3 years. It's a very long time for someone to make that critical transitional step into the country. The book is, I mean, the subtitle of this book, Americans No More, is The Death of Citizenship, and yet, at the end of the book, rather than continuing a kind of downward path that you see, the pendulum has already begun by the end of the book to swing up, and it ends on a note of optimism that citizenship is enjoying a kind of rebirth. You give examples of that.
Absolutely, Marcia. It's starting, but there's no, I posed the question at the end whether it can be done. I was thrilled when I continued my research to find that there are these new citizenship groups arising spontaneously all over the country, community groups in the universities who are trying to rethink where citizenship should be going. There are wonderful people in Congress like Dan Coates of Indiana, who's trying to work out ways to help citizenship through using funds that would go to welfare, to give them to local groups. There are some wonderful things going on, but they haven't come together yet. And they haven't made the link with the central government at all. So they're out there, they're everywhere, they're terrific people, but how do you get them together? Particularly when we have such a lowering of citizenship standards in this country, in the tests and in the preparation.
It's a subject we could talk about for a great deal of time, and unfortunately we have very little, in fact none left at all. Georgie Anne Geyer, I want to thank you for being a guest on Upon Reflection.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.